Sziasztok! The Hungarian Heritage Podcast is back for Season 3, and we are Hungarian Heritage Stronger Than Ever. For those of you who have been here a while, welcome back, and thanks so much for sticking around. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome! I'm so happy that you're joining us. My name is Christine, and I'm the host here at the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. During Season 3, I will continue to bring you guests and topics that celebrate Hungarian culture, people, and food. And of course, we will feature all of the cool things that Hungarians are doing around the world. Together, we will discover new things and review things that you may already know. And most of all, we will have a lot of fun along the way. One episode at a time, we will build those bridges between Hungarians who live in Hungary to those who live in other parts of the world. Not to mention the bridges we will build between the generations. So, if you're looking to make that first connection to your Hungarian heritage, or you're looking to strengthen your connection, then you found the right place. Join me, and together we will connect your modern lives to your Hungarian heritage by expanding this Hungarian heritage community and making the circles of Hungarians around us Hungarian heritage strong. Welcome to this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. We are back with another episode in our series of Celebrating Hungarian Heritage Together. Previously, my guests on the podcast, Réka Bakos and Dr. Anna Fenveysi, the editors of the book Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, have been my co-hosts for various episodes during Season 3 as we celebrate Hungarian heritage together. This collaborative series has featured guests who contributed their personal and family stories in Réka and Anna's book. In this episode, I'm thrilled to announce that my co-host will be Dr. Anna Fenveysi, and together we will be featuring Kati Csoman's Hungarian heritage story, which is featured in Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. As Kati shares her family story, you will not only learn about her father's journey to the U.S. from Hungary in 1956, but you will learn about Kati's Hungarian parents and their contributions and involvement in their Hungarian community in Pennsylvania and in the surrounding regions. This episode is so chock full of Hungarian heritage pride and examples of supporting the American Hungarian community that we had to split this interview into two parts. You will certainly feel the Hungarian connection when listening to Kati's family story, and you will realize that you are not alone in your Hungarian heritage journey. Listen along to part 1 of Kati Csoman's Hungarian Roots and American Dream story as we celebrate Hungarian heritage together. Please join me in welcoming back to the Hungarian Heritage Podcast Dr. Anna Fenveysi, co-editor of the newly released book Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. Anna was my guest along with her co-editor Réka Bakos in the first episode of Season 3, and she's also been my guest here on the podcast where she shared her recently completed Fulbright research about the Appalachian Hungarian Heritage Project, the sociolinguistics of Heritage Hungarian. Today, Anna is here not as my guest but as my co-host in this season's series of episodes celebrating Hungarian heritage together. Welcome back, Anna. I'm excited to partner with you on this collaborative series. Before we begin, we have some guests that might be joining us for the first time. So if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and just give a little overview about Hungarian Roots and American Dreams before we introduce our guest. Welcome, Anna. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you for having me again here on the podcast. I'm very excited to be here. I think we'll have a really great conversation today with our guest. But before we go into that, I'm a linguist, essentially. I got my PhD in linguistics at the University of Pittsburgh 30 years ago, and that really shaped my professional life. After I completed my graduate studies in Pittsburgh, I returned to Hungary, and so now I have been associate professor of linguistics at the University of Szeged in the English and American Studies Institute for 27 years. So that's my professional background. And in addition to that, for the past over 5 years, I've been researching my own family history, and that made me interested in genealogy and life stories in general. And that is how I met my co-editor Réka Bakos, because she and another person about a year ago founded this Facebook group that was dedicated to uncovering the stories, life stories of Hungarians who emigrated to the United States and in some cases returned, and their family histories. And that is where the idea for our book came, because when this group was founded, basically the first 2 or 3 weeks were a totally interesting process of people joining literally by the dozens every day and then sharing their families' very exciting stories. And I thought, oh my gosh, these stories need to be preserved, because it's one thing, to share a few paragraphs about your ancestors' story on Facebook, but it would be very good to preserve them in a book. That is where the idea of the book came from.
Yeah, it's definitely
Yeah,
important to just even historically collect these stories, because
absolutely.
you really don't know where
Absolutely.
someone can make a connection to another story that helps them further their own personal,
Yeah,
genealogical
yeah.
journeys. So,
And what I've been finding out recently, since the book came out, is that there's absolutely great interest in this book, because,
mm,
of course, we know a lot about Hungarian immigration to the United States. We know it from historical documents. We know it from genealogical documents. We know about it from people's memoirs and other books. But what makes this volume different is that it has many personal stories, and through these personal stories, you can see the variety of people who came over from Hungary to the United States, and also you can see the trends of how the big events of history shaped people's lives, and sometimes positively, many times negatively, and
right.
definitely impacted them in major ways.
Yeah,
And that is one aspect that you don't see in every book about Hungarian immigration to the United States, how people are impacted.
I agree. And, additionally, I feel as though this book of collected stories, opens up the opportunity for people to feel a little bit more connected to their Hungarian heritage. Because if you don't grow up near a Hungarian community, which is, was a little bit of the catalyst for this podcast, was to connect people. And, hearing
Right.
someone else's story, like I mentioned before, that might inspire you to do more research on your own or give you an idea that you hadn't thought about of how to stay connected or to be connected, because location is a factor, because if you're not near a community where you can attend a festival or go to a restaurant, and as we know, and that's not what this episode is about, but those are factors that affect connection to our culture and the availability as decades go on and families expand and outside of just marrying your own culture. So I've thoroughly enjoyed all the stories that we've recorded and all of those stories in the book. And I feel like it really supports what a longing for people. And I feel like you're feeling that people are receiving this information from this book so warmly, because I think they want it. Like there's so many people have said to me, even just about the podcast, like, oh, I just feel so connected now. And I feel like this book is also doing the same thing for people. So
Right.
excited to continue featuring the stories from your book and Reika's book. So please introduce our guest for today. I'm very excited to hear this story.
Yes, so our guest today is Kati Csoman from the University of Pittsburgh, where she is the director of the Nationality Rooms and Intercultural Exchange Programs. And Kati has spent many, many years, by now decades, working with intercultural exchanges and helping people have a good intercultural experience in the United States when they come from foreign countries. And now, in this position that she has had in the past 3 years, I think, she has returned to her academic roots. She's also a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and is in the position to help American students to go and rediscover their own roots. The Nationality Rooms and Intercultural Exchange programs fund scholarships for American students to go abroad and rediscover their roots. And she is also, of course, as you can guess from her name, Kati Csoman, a Hungarian American. And she was one of the authors for our book. She wrote up her father's story and her family's story. And that was one of the two stories in the book that featured the 1956 immigrants' experience. So welcome, Kati.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us here at the podcast. Something that I tell all of my guests is that even though your story might be different than someone else's story, there's always something that you can find a little connection to. And I feel like that's so valuable, as in what I just said about my podcast, about the book, Hungarian Roots, American Dreams. So I'm so happy that you're going to be here today to tell us your connection to your Hungarian heritage. And I'm personally excited because the beginning of your story and how your dad came here is very similar to some of the experiences that my family had. So I guess let's just get started and tell us a little bit about your dad, where he came from in Hungary, and how he came to the United States and all the things that were in between.
Sure. So my father, his name is Endre Csoman, and he was born in Heves megye in northeast Hungary, really in a very small village with one road that goes through it, Szabadság utca. And he grew up with, I guess, would be a fairly traditional village upbringing with extended family, cousins, other kind of probably distant relatives in that village and in the adjoining village. They weren't necessarily farmers, but lived a rural lifestyle. So, pretty simple lifestyle with school was probably the center of most of his youth. And then also whatever activities they would do in a small village, which if I remember, him talking about going to dances, playing soccer, of course, doing a fair amount of rebel rousing, maybe, if you will. So, maybe, before a dance or after a dance or during a dance, drinking at probably a fairly young age and, walking to and from the dance with all of his cousins and friends and, and then having whatever household chores one would have in a rural area. But I also remember my father, which is ironic given how he was as an adult, but often shrugging off his chores. So, and I always found that funny because my dad was such a hard worker and known for being a hard worker.
Well, I think it was just very typical, probably, kid and teenager behavior, which we were all there. So you were looking at him through the lens of a parent. So I guess that was good that he was responsible at that time.
Yeah.
So it seems like, throughout your life, you probably had the opportunity to hear so many stories about him growing up and like village life. And I know we talked off the air a little bit about how it's very similar to part of my family's growing up. And those are the stories that I looked forward to most hearing about, from my grandmother and what life was like. And I feel like that continued to grow the connection for me and maintain that, just that feeling of Hungarianness. So I'm sure you could probably fill multiple episodes about stories from your dad's childhood in that town. So tell us a little bit why and how he came to the US. Like, what was that experience like for him?
Yeah, so my dad would talk about the process a lot of coming to the US. Maybe I don't know as much about the reason why, but what I understand is as a 17-year-old with a few cousins and friends from the village, making a decision in October 1956 to leave Hungary. And so, I imagine it was both a push and pull, maybe feeling frightened about what they understood of a Soviet invasion, also, the draw of being in some other place and the opportunity that might provide. My father and several of the people with whom he left, they had been going through vocational training in Olst, specifically to work in the steel mills. I believe my father was primarily focusing on welding. So at any rate, they left one evening. I don't believe that they were really exactly honest with their families about what they were doing. They left, I think, by bus to go to Budapest, and then maybe a train and some walking. I know certainly walking across the border of Austria. I'd like to think that they really were probably pretty clueless about what they were doing, but just had this motivation to leave. And they ended up, his retelling is that the people who met them in Austria, and there was some drama about, crossing the border and, the danger of that. But the people they met in Austria were very kind, and helped them to navigate to a camp where they were for 2 months at least, because they then were able to travel to Germany in December. And on December 31st of 1956, get on a boat in Bremen, I believe, to come to the United States. And he stayed in that journey with his two cousins from the same village, and a few other friends from that same area. So they were able to travel together, all ending up in Camp Kilmore, New Jersey. And talked about the journey on the boat not being very pleasant. Everyone was quite, what is that, seasick, experienced seasickness. So one of his cousins, and we grew up in the area that I grew up in Southwest Pennsylvania. We grew up with the two cousins with whom my dad came. Our families grew up together, but I think the two cousins were they shared a bit more, I think, about the experience of coming over. I actually don't know how long they were in Camp Kilmore, but my understanding is from Camp Kilmore, different Hungarian congregations, church congregations, sponsored refugees. And so, and part of that was based on their training, their where they could work. And so my dad, his friends and cousins were brought by the Hungarian Reformed Church in Hazelwood and brought to that church. And that would have been sometime in the spring of 1957.
Yeah, I feel like the things that you're saying definitely like align with a lot of things that my family has also experienced as far as coming over. They did come by plane. I guess there were just different situations that happened, and you had a choice. Sometimes you didn't have a choice, as countries were coming to say, hey, come to our country. And sometimes the plane was full. And I know I mentioned this before, and my family almost ended up in England, which would not have been terrible, but I don't have an English accent. So clearly they also came through Camp Kilmer, which is another similarity. And it was very similar. I know my grandparents said the same thing, that it was about aligning it with what type of skills you had. And my grandfather was a machinist. So I guess you went where there were job opportunities, and they were in Carteret. So very similar situation. So it's nice to hear all the stories from people, but it is a little extra special for me to hear your story, because I feel like we could probably talk a little bit more offline about all of our shared experiences. So now your dad is in Pennsylvania, right? And he is a welder, as you said. But tell me a little bit about what his life was like in Hazelwood, Pennsylvania, and how he met your mom. And is she Hungarian? What are her roots about? Share with us a little bit about that.
Sure. So so the story goes, and I believe it to be true, but when the bus came in, one of the people to meet the bus was my mother's father. His name was Sándor Kovács, and I knew him very well growing up. And he went by the nickname Shine, and that described him very well. He was tall, he was very handsome, very dark hair, dark skin, a bright smile. But he was also, I understood, a chief elder in the Hungarian Reformed Church in Hazelwood on Johnston Avenue. He was also at a few other times president of the Hungarian Social Club on Flowers Avenue in Hazelwood. So he was a leader in the Hazelwood American Hungarian community. So he was one of the people who met and welcomed the busload of refugees. And the way that my father remembers it is he gave them oranges and gave them money to get haircuts, which would make good sense for my grandfather. He always wanted to and always did look very nice and dressed up and always smelled very nice. So that fits well with what his personality was like. I don't know how long my dad and cousins stayed in the Pittsburgh region, but I do know that they quickly became involved with the Hungarian social scene. So going to the dances, especially at the Hungarian clubs, there were clubs in McKeesport and Homestead and Hazelwood and Coriopolis. And my understanding is that my parents actually met sometime in that spring at a dance at the Hungarian club in Coriopolis, not the one in Hazelwood. But then at some other point, as maybe they kept meeting up at these dances, my mother wanted to introduce my father to her father, Sándor, and she did, but each of them missed the fact that my father already knew Sanyi Bácsi from having met him initially, and and feeling very welcomed by him. My mother's parents were both Hungarian. They were first generation Hungarian. So their parents came from Transylvania, from Hungary. My grandfather, his parents were Ida and now I'm forgetting his father's name, Kovács. And my grandmother, her mother was Raquel, and her father was Frank Egri. And so she grew up in Duquesne. Both my grandparents, their primary language growing up was Hungarian. And that probably makes great sense in terms of, that generation of people. I don't exactly know where they met. At any rate, they had two children, my mother, Arlene, and a son, Alan. My mother, for the first few years of her life, her parents were separated. And so she grew up in the household in Duquesne with her grandmother, whom she loved dearly, and with her mother. And so the first language that my mother learned was Hungarian. And I can share a funny story about that later, about when my mother came to visit me in Hungary. And I had no idea the degree to which she knew Hungarian. And so I was really blown away by that. At any rate, so my parents met at a dance, and I think they were pretty quick to, become a couple and really, date for several years, so from 57 through, I guess they were married in 61, something like that. Mm-hmm. But I do have a lot of photos in our family photos of my dad joining her family on trips to Washington, D.C., trips to the ocean. So I believe that my grandparents really loved my father, and that he was close with my grandparents, and that they very much approved of the relationship. And so, yeah. And so my parents were very involved with, my dad did, I think in that spring, move to Beaver Falls, where there was a steel mill where he and one of the cousins, Joe Fabry, were working. I believe that's what they were doing there initially, but living in Beaver Falls. And then one of the uncles, András Spagina, he stayed in Squirrel Hill, and he was working as a domestic help in a very large, wealthy home, actually, the Post family home. The people who own the cereal company are a descendant of those people. So very big home that still exists in Squirrel Hill. So, yeah, so my dad was basically living as a young man, going back and forth to Pittsburgh to spend time with my mother, learning to live on his own. So he had funny stories about, things that they would cook, or, it was I have some great photos of them with beautiful cars. That was something important to them. So they would, get
That's
in
so
a cool
strange.
car.
I have pictures of my grandparents also too taking pictures in front of their cars.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was generational or was it Hungarian specific, so that's funny that you said that.
Yeah, I imagine it represents some level of, achievement from hard work and,
Sure.
and some status. Yeah, so that's pretty much what his life was work. I think that they were working hard. They were trying to learn English.
Yeah.
And, my dad, of the three close cousins, my dad's, even though he had a very strong accent, his English was very good. And later he became quite a good writer and storyteller, but writer especially of local Hungarian or American Hungarian history. So he would write quite a bit for different fraternal publications and other things.
Yeah, I feel like we haven't even explored your entire family's history yet, and it seems as though this could be like a little mini series of his life so far. And I feel that way a lot about the people I speak with because I think we're lucky that we haven't had to experience such traumatic things and movement in our lives politically, socioeconomically. And I feel that that builds a person's character. And you really feel that coming through. Like I feel that when you're explaining about your dad and, commenting about how hardworking and just really that stick-to-itiveness, personality, and that really shines through when you're telling the story as well. So it's so nice to hear that because, we are fortunate, and I hope that we continue to remain fortunate to live
Yeah.
peaceful lives. But
Yeah.
it's I don't like to use the word common story because everybody wants to tell about their 56 story, but everybody's story is different. So
Right.
because it might start out similar, but it just fans out from there as far as regarding jobs and who people marry and also where you live. So pretty exciting to hear other people speak of their stories.
Just a side comment on cars from a linguistic point of view. When I was interviewing American Hungarians back in McKeesport in the 1990s, I noticed that even the immigrants who were mostly 1956 immigrants, and I was interviewing them in Hungarian at that point, they always switched to English when it came to the subject of cars because they did not have the vocabulary in Hungarian to talk about cars because, let's face it, back in the 1940s and 50s, it was very uncommon for average people in Hungary to own cars. And so I think it was a very unique experience to the 1956 immigrants to come to the US and own a car. But they
Yeah.
also learned the vocabulary of car parts and everything you do
Yeah.
in English. Yeah.
That's a great point because there weren't words created at that time, which I guess has developed into the Hunglish that we speak of, especially for those of us who have had, or even family that grew up in villages like both of us. But
Right.
even if you lived in like the big city of Budapest, you still probably weren't driving a car. So you could see how linguistically those words weren't available.
And
So.
Anna, do I remember that they would use the word kare or something? You would.
Yeah.
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 Kare was the borrowing that was used by American Hungarians, and
Yeah.
it's a very interesting word because I thought about it, for I mean a lot, why
Mhm.
kare? But there are also other words that parallel this, like hale for
Mhm.
hall, like social hall.
Okay.
That was called hale.
Mhm.
Um, and I remember asking other people who were linguists and studied American Hungarian language use, and they did not have a good explanation either. So basically, our consensus was that it might have been from some commonly used East European lingo.
Mhm.
Uh, with the Slovaks and the Poles and the
Mhm.
Ukrainians who were in big cities like Pittsburgh, that It's
Sure.
it was a word that evolved and was then used by all the immigrants. Very
Yeah.
interesting, Kati. Yeah.
I always have so many questions about words. I didn't mention that I'm a retired English teacher. So like words, and especially growing up in a multilingual household,
Mhm.
I wasn't taught Hungarian, which I know I didn't mention before, because my mom isn't Hungarian. That's a story for another time. But like words that I heard my grandparents say. So my grandfather would always say, like, you go to the toilet, because that's a very common European word, right? But he would say toilet. I'm thinking, why would he say that? Why would he say toilet? But I wasn't going to correct him. He was like the sweetest, most loving man that ever lived on the planet. I've been to Hungary, multiple times. We're in the Fisherman's Bastion, and we're, winding back down around, and there's, restrooms, and above it, it said toilet. I'm like, okay, he knew what he was talking about. The word must have developed somehow, with
Yeah.
an A in there.
Yeah.
So those are interesting connections, I feel like, we make, especially as
Yeah.
myself a little bit more as an American Hungarian.
Yeah, I think my favorite word along these lines is the word virágboxi, flower box,
Yeah,
because it's a mix of
yeah,
a Hungarian and an English word. Virág is Hungarian for flower, and boxy is an English loan word in American Hungarian, and the
yeah.
two just make just such a beautiful, combination.
Your parents, Kati, were very involved in their Hungarian community. And I think because of the time that they came to well, your mom was here and when your dad came over, and we've talked a little bit about, probably with Anna in another episode, of just like third spaces, of having these places to go to meet people, and social clubs and churches, which are, I'm not saying that they're not available now, but definitely more prevalent.
Yeah.
In previous generations, like they were more available and more common to go to, which I believe mirrored a lot of like what their lives were like, maybe, in other immigrant, like even any immigrant when they were coming to the U.S., because they were getting together culturally. So now they wanted to continue meeting up culturally as well. So your parents continued to be involved in many great things. So tell us a little bit about their contributions to the HRFA, the WPA, and the Hungarian picnic traditions, and I'll let you define what those letters mean.
Yeah, thank you. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot and actually really concerned about it as it
Okay.
relates to contemporary times in terms of community. And
Right.
so I think I know if one thing, these immigrant communities have really had it right. They really got it right in terms
Yeah.
of understanding the importance of community
Hmm.
and of extended connection. And I so appreciate that now about my parents and to some degree my grandfather too, who was, Mr. Social. And, at the time growing up, because I'm not particularly a social person, I'm kind of an introvert. I think growing up in a household of five kids, it was always chaotic. And so I'm bookish and quiet. And at any rate, now I can reflect on it and appreciate it so much. And my parents were so driven by the social connection that really, and it's to both of their credit that it extended, I would say, almost across the nation, because
Yeah.
of the work that they did. So the Fraternal Benefits Society, I'll just give a brief history of that. They were established by working class communities, miners, others. And basically, it was a way to create a social welfare net among these communities. They would collect um, dimes, nickels, whatever, from families. And then that money would be put into the association. And if somebody experienced a death, it would go to that family to help support them, because
Right.
the minor dad lost his life in a coal mining accident. So there are the two with which my parents were involved, and I should know their histories better, but one is was the Hungarian Reform Federation of America. That probably, I believe, started out of New Jersey, actually,
Yeah.
and then moved to Washington, D.C. in the
Mhm.
time that my father was a national vice president. It was at DuPont Circle in a place that still exists called Kossuth House. So this really
Mhm.
beautiful
Mhm.
Art Deco building, which now I think is associated um, with the Hungarian embassy in the United States or some extension of that. It's a cultural center. And then the one with which my father was involved later then was the Vehovadi Association, which then became the William Penn Association, which is
Right.
housed in Pittsburgh on the north
Mhm.
side. So my dad, I think, started to become involved with these organizations maybe in the 70s, mid 70s, late 70s, something like that. But basically as an insurance agent and really to pick up extra income. So my parents would travel around regionally,
Mhm.
as far away as Johnstown and Windber and Nantiglow. So these are southwest and coming into central Pennsylvania, these little Hungarian communities. And at the time, I remember that my parents would go together. They always traveled together, but he'd have this little black kind of binder that would have handwritten notes for each of the
Mhm.
persons, right?
Yeah.
And then, you would make the notes. But when I think about it, it was so much more than collecting that money. It was really connecting with these people
Yeah.
of really all generations. And so my parents did that for many years. And then in the 80s, early 80s, my dad became involved of the board of directors of the Hungarian Reform Federation of America. And that was, rather kind of glamorous, if you will, because they would go to the meetings, and it would be staying in a very nice hotel with nice meals and, having parties in the hotel rooms with lots of alcohol and kolbas and, cheese and all of that, and, lots of politicking, if you will. And so my dad became elected as a national officer for the Hungarian Reform Federation of America. And he did that for 8 years, living in Washington, D.C., but pretty much every single weekend traveling back to Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania,
Mhm.
and then left the HRFA and I think worked another 20 years with the William Penn Association. These fraternal benefits societies at some point are given a special designation within the U.S. Tax law, if you will, but essentially they're nonprofit organizations. And so the money that they bring in, and some of them, they're are multi-million dollar organizations. It has to go back to the membership. It has to benefit the community, benefit the membership. And so in both positions, that was really my dad's work, was to build the membership and to support the Hungarian American community. And so, in both organizations, that entailed travel around the United States to support the Hungarian American community, the churches, the social organizations, the associated organizations. So, for example, you mentioned New Brunswick and the festival. I know that festival very well, first weekend in June.
Yep.
My parents were there every first weekend in June to represent first the Hungarian Reform Federation of
Mhm.
America and then the William Penn Association.
Yeah.
We went a couple of times. I mean, I have very, lovely memories of walking up and down Somerset Street, going into the Hungarian Social Club. I think it's the Sports Club. That was a new, beautiful building. And then
Yeah.
our way down for the Twilight concert at the
Yeah.
Hungarian American Foundation.
Yeah. You
You
should
know,
definitely come this year.
I know.
I'm gonna definitely influence you to make sure you come
Oh, I should.
again to, reconnect with that. But we can talk
Yeah,
about that later. But yeah,
yeah.
it's a great event.
It's
And
a lovely event. And so, and we all grew up with that. So we grew up in I think, a really kind of, I believe now, again, reflecting, you don't know what you don't know. Like
yeah.
for us, what was normal was really odd to our friends. So we had this typical American life. We were
Yeah.
all high school students.
Hmm.
did cheerleading and, you know, we were all involved in the school and things. But then we had this home life where we also did not learn Hungarian, but heard it every day because,
Yeah.
you know, my dad was on the phone with whomever, always speaking Hungarian. He usually talked to his two cousins every day. And then our lifestyle was, I would say, very Hungarian. Again, I learned that after I went to Hungary and was able to live there. But, you know, we would have bowls of tomatoes from one of my dad's several gardens on the table and peppers, like
Yeah.
just, you know, and the smell of that. And, you know, and every year my dad would can from his multiple gardens again. And it was usually lecho and, you
Yeah.
know,
Hmm.
peppers of some sort, savanyúság.
And
And
all types of bean variety of soups, right? Do you remember
yeah,
that? Yeah, yeah.
yes, yeah.
Hmm.
And so, you know, so the way that my parents cooked was not, I would say, typical American because soups were really central. At
Hmm.
some point in this house that we moved into when I was in third grade, so in the early 70s, my dad built himself a second kitchen downstairs, fully equipped kitchen.
Yeah.
And I would say even more so because my dad was like over the top with cooking. So he would have, you know, large pots and, you know, even built things to accommodate his cooking of goulash, for example. So,
Yeah.
you know, so one of the things that my dad was known for was his cooking and cooking that either contributed to these picnics that we would
Hmm.
have. And so his first set of picnics were with the Hungarian Reform Federation at a place that still exists but is no longer the same. It was called the Bethlehem Home. So it
Okay.
was part of a larger grouping of Hungarian sort of welfare organizations in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. So there was an orphanage. There was this
Hmm.
old folks home,
Yeah.
and yeah, and so this whole grouping of kind of, and I think Anna shared with me that my grandmother, my mother's mother, maybe spent some time in that orphanage in Ligonier at some point during
Wow.
her childhood, which was shocking to find out, and I'd love to find out more about that. So at any rate, these picnics were held at Ligonier, which had a beautiful grounds, and actually they had brought some members from Transylvania
Hmm.
who would work in the kitchen and things. And that one couple, Lutzi and Erzsébet, they now own an inn,
Oh.
Darlington Inn in Ligonier, which is a wonderful Hungarian restaurant. I've never been there, but you know, my parents, they spent a lot of time with Lutzi and Erzsébet, and I've heard it's wonderful. I do need to make my way there. But Lutzi had created this beautiful a la Transylvanian style kapu, wooden
Hmm.
carved gate to the Bethlehem home, which I think is still there. So at any rate, the picnics were great. It was a focus on music and Hungarian food,
Yeah.
goya, langos, salana, sütés, all of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, they did that for several years. It kind of outgrew its space. I think it got up to well over several hundred people. And then when my dad went to the William Penn Association,
Hmm.
they started the picnic event again, and that was held in a property called Scenic View down in southwest Pennsylvania in the Laurel
Okay.
Highlands. And that was about food, music, but that turned out to be an event towards its end that had over 1,000 people and would bring people together about a week before the event to do all the cooking that was necessary. So,
Hmm.
you know, big, huge pots of goulash and, you know, langos station and the salana sütés, the bacon fry over in one corner. And so it was really, you know, and of course, again, you know, it was always kind of exhausting for us. My husband and I were always the cleanup crew the day after on Sunday, hours and hours cleaning, you know, industrial
Sure. All the
size
big
pots.
pots. Yeah.
Yes, all the big pots, all the, you know, everything. And so, yeah, and so that for all of us was really growing up. It was, you know, very central to my parents' life. All this going about and out and about on the weekends, flying to different places, the picnics, you know, my parents would basically go away for about 2 weeks because they would prepare for the picnic and then they
Yeah.
would, all the work that happened after the picnic. So, yeah, so I think you were saying, Christine, about, I guess it's an evolving community, and it's certainly
Yeah.
true. I would say evolving communities. It's definitely, if you come to Pittsburgh, can walk around and show, but these churches that are the central part of the communities, and then all of those associated clubs or, schools, they are just few and far between.
Yeah.
The buildings are being closed up, they're being sold off in some ways for good use. In other ways, they remain unused. We just went to the Hazelwood Church at Christmas Eve, and it was lovely to go, but it was probably about 20 people.
Yeah.
And the person leading has been leading the sermon, if you will, or the session, has been a long-term member, but there's not really an active minister at this time.
Hmm.
Um, Reverend Komyati had become ill and is in long-term care. So yeah, so the sort of the fabric, if you will, is definitely coming apart, I would say.
Yeah.
Although that, the McKeesport Church with Reverend Daniel Borshai, whom Anna knows quite well, is still fairly active, and they have their sales of chicken paprikash and stuffed cabbage, and they still are, have a fairly, I think, robust congregation. But otherwise, the churches, probably the few remaining
Mm.
churches will not, I would imagine, last much longer. And
Right.
yeah,
Well, to go back to what you were saying previously, just about, being involved with the insurance and visiting families, I feel like everything your parents did was really to continue maintaining connection because I feel like that's what they had growing up. And so they were trying to maintain the culture,
yeah,
and everything that goes along with it, food, togetherness, folk dancing, or just, being in the social hall. And I do have to say that, like, my grandmother, she passed in 2011, but with the insurance, my grandmother was very connected still. No, it has to be, this person. I've been working with her for, I don't know, 40 years. And like this woman has come to my home and, who was an elder in like the New Brunswick community. So I get that. I feel like people, no matter how much they've created on purpose or not on purpose, like a distance from that central Hungarian community of where maybe everybody lived to begin with, they still have certain things that they want to make sure that they stay connected.
yeah,
Even though families are dissipating and moving, and it's really like just like the globalization essentially,
it is.
because it's not like people stayed in the same vicinity, or they stayed in the same vicinity, but now there's just so much opportunity otherwise and other reasons that people move. And I said this
Right,
in another episode with Anna. It's like when you throw a pebble in water and then the rings start to form around it. It's essentially how I'm sure other cultures have also experienced that, where it's very close in the beginning and then families move out. And, keeping that connection is something that your parents really were very adventurous in maintaining and trying to spread that
yeah,
connection around. And like the need for that connection, I think was very valuable. And I think it's valuable today. And I feel like there's definitely room for that. Like I think we need more of that because as you were saying with the church attendance and things as such, it's waning. It's not as a tight-knit community anymore because people, I don't think, live in the community anymore. Like they might come out for a bigger event, for example, like the Hungarian Festival, the first Saturday of
right,
June. Like people do come back and they revisit because they want to connect with people, maybe talk with some people that speak the language. I know that's something that people have said to me as well. Like, oh, it's just so nice to come back so that I can hear the Hungarian language because I don't live near anyone anymore. And especially like the food. And I feel like your parents were such an important part of keeping that community together. An interesting fact, though, I feel like having two Hungarian parents, they still didn't teach you the language, which
yeah,
I feel so much better about myself.
yeah,
Because like I think one would assume, at least now, I think now in 2025, that so many cultures that are trying to keep that connection,
right,
and teach their kids, which isn't always the case, but I guess generationally they were just trying to push, as I was pushed to be American, outside the
Yeah.
home and Hungarian inside the home and with our, outside activities.
I found that funny with my father, especially, who was so proudly Hungarian and,
Yeah.
really tried his best to promote the Hungarian American experience and the history. And, again, he
Mm,
wrote all of these articles for Fenveysi, which was the HRFA publication, and then the William Penn Association's publication. And he would do these different for lack of a better word, pilgrimages. So there was the Darmine disaster remembrance that he
right.
organized,
Okay.
and he did a pilgrimage to Kossuth at the time I was pregnant with my son. So this would have been in 1994. But
Okay.
the little town in Northwest Pennsylvania was named Kossuth after Kossuth had come through
Yeah.
the United
Hmm.
States on whatever tour. And my dad discovered this, and so they did a whole remembrance of Lajos Kossuth in this little town. But it was interesting that he also, in some ways, was disconnected from Hungary, I would say, and
Right.
was also, he spoke Hungarian every day for sure, and was thrilled when I started to study Hungarian, and we would speak Hungarian together. But for himself, I think was proudly trying to establish himself as American. And I would say he probably had this weird understanding of himself, proudly Hungarian, never ashamed of that background, always shared that, but then was very much in his mindset, I think, in his perspective. He just had this fraught relationship, I would say, because when he started going back to
Mhm.
Hungary, starting in the 1970s, it was hard for him to reconcile, I think,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
and I think it got easier as things changed in Hungary,
Sure.
and he would take, that was the other thing that he and my mom did with the William Penn Association. I think they took 6 or more trips to Hungary with groups of people, like sort of these heritage
Right.
experiences, and would have a
Mhm.
blast, going for a couple of weeks with a group of tourists, really. But yeah, I would say his relationship with Hungary was fraught, and that included kind of, his with his village, and yeah, because his one
Sure.
cousin was like could never get over leaving Hungary.
Sure.
That was really different, and would always talk about things that were better in Hungary. And I would say that was
Right.
not the case with my dad. It was
Right.
complicated.
This is actually a pattern that I've been seeing in interviewing the children and grandchildren of or descendants of Hungarian immigrants. That even though many immigrants in their lifetimes in the United States, were very active members of organizations and did really a lot for these organizations and kept them alive. They felt that the first and foremost their children should be and become Americans, and
Yeah.
part of that was, of course, learning to speak English and using English as much as possible, because that's
Hmm.
how they saw the sort of social advancement and economic
Hmm.
advancement, which of course was
Yeah.
basically all parents want the best for their children, and
Sure.
it was the way to a better life, quote unquote.
Makes a lot of sense because I feel like that connects to so many people's stories, even in different time periods, not just the people that came over in
Right.
56. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, let's round out talking about your parents,
Mm.
because your dad also received 2 very noteworthy honors. So, tell us about those because I feel like they're worth mentioning because it really reflects his life's work. Tell us about that.
And I should have had this ready, but I
That's
forgot to
okay.
look up the years. But one of them was an honor of Fraternalist of the Year for, I
Hmm.
believe, Pennsylvania, which was,
Okay.
which is really a lovely honor that he received. And because Pennsylvania was is a big fraternal organization state. And then another honor that he received, and I still don't quite know the name of the honor, but he received a medal, which I believe is the St. George's Cross. But he was invited to Hungary and was recognized by the Hungarian government for his work in the Hungarian American community. And so that was, of course, a huge deal. And I believe, I can't recall if my mom could join him for receiving that, because my mom had gone through a couple of bouts of breast cancer, but it was a huge deal. But if you can imagine being invited back by the government of Hungary to receive what I understand to be a very high level honor, was very deeply meaningful for my father, because he really did devote so much of his life through upholding the American Hungarian community and working in Washington, D.C. He became connected with the Hungarian embassy in the United States. And so was making that connection between, the United States and Hungary. And
I just looked it up so we can
thank you.
record it. So I believe that was 2012 when Endre Csoman received the Civilian Order of Merit of the Hungarian Order of Merit, the Magyar Érdemrend középkeresztje polgári tagozata in Hungarian. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah.
I feel like that really rounded out all of his hard work and effort, and really just was so meaningful, I'm sure, to his life, that he was able to be, recognized, because it is a lot of hard work to maintain your culture, and it's a lot of hard work to maintain other people as well, and keep that connection with people.
Yeah.
So he really had, I would even say, like, heroic efforts that he made in the Hungarian community to keep people together and maintain that connections. Thanks for joining me and Dr. Anna Fenveysi for part 1 of Kati Csoman's Hungarian Roots and American Dream story on this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. So don't forget to stay tuned, because part 2 of Kati's Hungarian Roots and American Dream story is coming out next week. And if you think this episode had a lot of Hungarian heritage pride, just wait until you hear part 2. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, either in English or in Hungarian, you will find that information in the show notes. If you have feedback or questions about this episode, or you would like to connect with me at the podcast, you will also find that information in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode and you're interested in learning more about this Hungarian heritage community, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Our theme music is Hungarian Dance by Pony Music, used with a special license from Envato Market. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, make sure you stay Hungarian Heritage Strong. Sziasztok!